Okay, so the first thing you're going to do is make a guess. So here's a jelly bean guessing contest. You're going to guess how many jelly beans are in this jar. So I've put the dimensions of your jelly bean jar right here. If your jelly bean jar is about 30 centimeters tall, 15 centimeters wide, and 15 centimeters long, and each jelly bean is about 14 cubic centimeters, then how many jelly beans are in this jar? Well, by the end of today's lesson, we might be able to figure it out, but let's first see if you can just take a guess. What do you think? Take a wild guess. How many jelly beans are in this jar? 5, 100, 1,000? What do you think? All right, well, turns out, see if you were close. There are about 350 jelly beans in this jar. Were you close? Were you totally off? Well, let's take a look and figure out if we could solve and get a little bit more accurate with how many jelly beans are in this jar. So in order to solve for how many jelly beans are in that jar, we have to find the volume. The volume is the availability of space inside something. So in order to figure out how many jelly beans could fit in that jar, we first have to just figure out how much space is inside that jar. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to figure out how much space is inside shapes. So let's start with our rectangular prism and our triangular prism. So like I said, the amount a container will hold is called its capacity or its volume. And volume is often going to be measured in cubic units. So cubic units means that there are going to be 3 measurements that we use to multiply to find out volume. So volume might sound complicated, but I think it's actually even easier to find than surface area. So to find the volume of a rectangular prism, we have a super simple formula. And that formula is volume equals length times width times height. And then the volume of a triangular prism is going to be pretty similar. Volume equals length times width times height, but we're going to cut it in half. All right, let's take a look at why and how to use those formulas. So why, for a triangular prism, are we going to cut it in half? Well, a triangular prism is half of a rectangular prism. So since a triangular prism is half, then that's why we cut it in half. So if I look right here, and it's half of that rectangular prism, that's why we're going to cut that rectangular prism in half to find the triangular prism's volume. All right, so let's take a look at a couple of these practice problems. So like I said, the volume, solving for the volume, that inside space, is actually quite a bit easier than surface area because you only have to really do one calculation. You're just multiplying 3 numbers times each other. So the volume, or the equation, is volume equals length times width times height. And so for our first problem here, we're going to just multiply all 3 of these numbers times each other. So volume equals 12 times 9 times 4. And so we will calculate, just type those 3 numbers into our calculator. So 12 times 9 times 4. And that first problem gives us volume equals 432 inches cubed. Now here's the really important part, was when we were finding area, it was inches squared, right? But that's when we multiply 2 things times each other, just 2 measurements, like the length and the width, or the length and the height. For volume, we have 3 measurements that we're multiplying times each other, and so it's a cubed answer because there are 3 measurements. It's a 3-dimensional figure. All right, so let's move on to number 2. So number 2, our equation to find the volume is still going to be the length times the width times the height. And so we will do volume equals 16 times 2 times 1. So 16 times 2 is going to give us 32, and 32 times 1 is 32. And then you're going to add that unit on, meters cubed. All right, so one more. I'm going to have you pause the video and give this one a try and see if you get to the same answer that I do. All right, so volume equals length times width times height. And one thing I notice is that this is a square cube. All these numbers are exactly the same. So its volume equals 7 cubed. And 7 to the third, I can type that into my calculator. If I were to type this into my calculator as 7 cubed, I'm hitting the button. So I'm hitting the button 7. And then I'm hitting the button that looks like an upside down triangle without a bottom. 7. And that means raised to the third. So 7 raised to the third power, which means 7 cubed, or 7 times 7 times 7. And when I do that, 7 times 7 times 7, I get 343. So 343 centimeters cubed. All right, so I have my 3 answers here for volume. Great job. So our next slide here is doing the volume of a triangular prism. Now remember what we said is that a triangular prism is half of a rectangular prism. So we kind of have 2 different formulas or ways to write it. So it could be that volume equals 1/2 times the length times the width times the height. Or sometimes I think what might be even a little bit easier, because fractions sometimes get us a little bit nervous, is to just do volume equals length times width times height, and then in the end divide it by 2. Same thing as multiplying it by 1/2. They equal the same thing. Okay, so for my first problem here, I have 3 measurements. Now again, when you're doing this, you still need to find the area of that base, and the area of that base is going to tell us it's the triangle, and it's going to tell us that we have to use that length times width. So it's really going to be pretty simple to figure out, but just make sure that you're using those numbers that represent the lines that make up that 90-degree angle. So it's 6 and 8, right? 6 and 8 make up those sides that give us that 90-degree angle. So 6, that's a 6, times 8, times 10, and then we divide all that by 2. So 6 times 8 times 10 is going to give me 480. And I divide that by 2 because it's a triangle. And so I get that my volume equals 240 feet cubed. All right, so there's the volume of my first triangular prism. All right, my next one is 6 times 6 times 6. So the volume equals 6 cubed, or 6 times 6 times 6. So I'm going to use that caret, that upside down triangle on my calculator. 6 caret 3, 6 raised to the third power. And then I have to divide it by 2. So I get volume equals 216 divided by 2. And I get 108 meters cubed. All right, good, good. So now we're going to be looking at this last one, and here's my triangle, and I think this one, I'm going to show you this because I think this one makes it really easy to see, is that when we're doing volume, we're really just finding the area of the base, and you're going to see this tomorrow too in a video that we watch tomorrow, but you're really just finding the area of the base. So the area of this triangle right here is going to be 4 times 5 divided by 2, and then times 10, because it's times 10 of the height. How many of these triangles can fit inside this whole triangle? Okay, so this would be the same thing as 4 times 5 times 10 divided by 2. It's all going to give you the same final answer. So 4 times 5 is 20, and then 20 divided by 2 is 10, and 10 times 10 will give you 100. So 100 feet cubed is the volume of this triangle. Now, the other thing we can do is 4 times 5 times 10 divided by 2, just like we said before. So 4 times 5 times 10 is going to give me 200. And then 200 divided by 2 is going to give me 100. So either way of writing these will get me to the same answer. Okay, so now we have finding volume is really pretty simple. So I'm going to challenge us into being able to solve for volume in order to work backwards if you are given the volume. So to find a length of one of the sides. Okay, so whenever we do this, remember it's important, and we were working backwards and we were finding circles and things like that too. And it's always important to know your formula. Volume equals length times width times height, right? The volume of a rectangular prism. So it's telling us that the volume is 200. So we replace volume, or V, with 200. And then it's saying that the length is 10. All right, so we know that the length is 10. And the height is 12. So we don't know the W, but we know that the height is 12. So we're figuring out what is the width. So the first thing we're going to do, guys, is just to simplify. So I'm going to multiply 10 times 12. So 10 times 12 is going to give me 120. So in order to simplify my equation, I have 200 equals 120 W. Well, now this is just a one-step equation, right? So I'm going to divide both sides by 120 so that I can get W all by itself. So when I do that, I'm going to get W equals, and 200 divided by 120 is going to give me 1.67, or 1.6 repeating. All right, so my width on that one is going to be, it's kind of like a weird number, a weird like decimal, but that is just the width of this shape. So the width of that arm is 1.67 inches. All right. So let's try this one. Now it's saying the volume of a triangular prism is 288 centimeters. So triangular prism. So volume equals length times width times height, and then divided by 2. Remember, a triangular prism gets divided by 2. All right, so my volume is 288. And then I'm going to figure out what else I know. So I know the width is 6. And I know that the length is 12. So 12 is my length, times 6 is my width, times h is my height. We don't know that yet, because that's what we're solving for. And all of that divided by 2. So the first thing I'm going to do is simplify my expression. So 12 times 6 is 72. So 288 equals 72 h divided by 2. All right. Now here's the only tricky part. Whenever I have a divided by, right, like a divided by 2, I want to undo that first. So in order to get rid of divided by 2, I'm just going to simply multiply by 2, because that will cancel out. Anything divided by 2 times 2 cancels it out there. So if I multiply by 2 on the right side, I multiply by 2 on the left side. So 288 times 2 is going to give me 576, and that's going to equal 72h. And now I have to get rid of 72, which is multiplying times the h. So in order to get rid of that, I do the opposite, which is divide, right? 72 divided by 72 cancels out, and I have to divide by 72 on the left side also. So h is going to leave me with 576 divided by 72. So h is 8. All right, so h is 8 centimeters, the size of the length of the height. All right, so that's it for today. please go ahead and grab your practice work. All right, and then just check in with the agenda to see what you have to do next.